What is up, guys? As always, come to classwork here. If we go down to day 16, we'll find our PDF. And today we're doing an audio of chapter 10. Okay, so let's get down here towards chapter 10, find it on here. Chapter 9 there, and chapter 10. So, this is on page, let's see, what page is this of our PDF? It's not one to tell me. Oh well, so sorry about that, guys. Alright, and we will begin. When the truck had gone, loaded with implements, with heavy tools, with beds and springs, with every movable thing that might be sold, Tom hung around the place. He mooned into the barn shed, into the empty stalls, and he walked into the implement lean-to and kicked the refuse that was left, turned a broken mower tooth with his foot. He visited places he remembered, the red bank where the swallows nested, the willow tree over the pig pen. Two shoats grunted and squirmed at him through the fence, black pigs, sunning and comfortable. And then his pilgrimage was over, and he went to sit on the doorstep where the shade was lately fallen. Behind him, Ma moved about in the kitchen, washing children's clothes in a bucket, and her strong freckled arms dripped soap suds from the elbows. She stopped her rubbing when he sat down. She looked at him a long time, and at the back of his head when he turned and stared out at the hot sunlight. And then she went back to her rubbing. She said, "Tom, I hope things is all right in California." He turned and looked at her. "What makes you think they ain't?" he asked. "Well, nothin'. Seems too nice, kinda. I seen the handbills fellas pass out, and how much work they is, and high wages and all. And I seen in the paper how they want folks to come and pick grapes and oranges and peaches. That'd be nice work, Tom, pickin' peaches. Even if they wouldn't let you eat none. You could maybe snatch a little ratty one sometimes. And it'd be nice under the trees, workin' in the shade. I'm scared of stuff so nice. I ain't got faith. I'm scared something ain't so nice about it." Tom said, "Don't roust your faith, bird high, and you won't do no crawlin' with the worms." "I know that's right. That's scripture, ain't it?" "I guess so," said Tom. "I never could keep scripture straight since I read a book named The Winning of Barbara Worth." Ma chuckled lightly and scrunched the clothes in and out of the bucket, and she wrung out overalls and shirts, and the muscles of her forearms corded out. "Your pa's pa, he quoted scripture all the time. He got it all roiled up, too. It was the Dr. Miles almanac he got mixed up. Used to read every word in that almanac out loud. Letters from folks that couldn't sleep or had lame backs. And later he'd give them people for a lesson. And he'd say, 'That's a parable from Scripture.' Your pa and Uncle John troubled him some about it when they'd laugh." She piled wrung clothes like cordwood on the table. "They say it's 2,000 miles where we're going. How far you think that is, Tom? I seen it on a map, big mountains like on a postcard, and we're going right through 'em. How long you suppose it'll take to go that far, Tommy?" "I don't know," he said. 2 weeks, maybe 10 days if we got luck. Look, Ma, stop your worrying. I'm going to tell you something about being in the pen. You can't go thinking when you're going to be out. You'd go nuts. You got to think about that day, and then the next day, about the ball game Saturday. That's what you got to do. Old timers does that. A new young fella gets butting his head on the cell door. He's thinking how long it's going to be. Why don't you do that? Just take every day." "That's a good way," she said, and she filled up her bucket with hot water from the stove, and she put in dirty clothes and began punching them down into the soapy water. "Yes, that's a good way. But I like to think how nice it's going to be, maybe, in California. Never cold, and fruit every place. And people just being in the nicest places, little white houses in among the orange trees. I wonder, that is, if we all get jobs and all work, maybe we can get one of them little white houses. And the little fellas go out and pick oranges right off the tree. They ain't going to be able to stand it. They'll get to yelling so." Tom watched her working, and his eyes smiled. "It done you good just thinking about it. I knowed a fella from California. He didn't talk like us. You'd have knowed he'd come from some far-off place just the way he talked. But he says there's too many folks looking for work right there now. And he says that folks that pick the fruit live in dirty old camps and don't hardly get enough to eat. He says wages is so low and hard to get any. A shadow crossed her face. Oh, that ain't so, she said. Your father got a handbill on yellow paper telling how they need folks to work. They wouldn't go to that trouble if there wasn't plenty of work. Cost them good money to get them handbills out. What'd they want to lie for? And costed them money to lie? Tom shook his head. I don't know, Ma. It's kind of hard to think why they done it. Maybe. He looked out at the hot sun, shining on the red earth. Maybe what? Maybe it's nice, like you says. Where'd Grandpa go? Where'd the preacher go? Ma was going out of the house, her arms loaded high with clothes. Tom moved aside to let her pass. Preacher says he's going to walk around. Grandpa's asleep here in the house. He comes in here in the day and lays down sometimes. She walked to the line and began to drape pale blue jeans and blue shirts and long gray underwear over the wire. Behind him, Tom heard a shuffling step and he turned to look in. Grandpa was emerging from the bedroom, and as in the morning, he fumbled with the buttons of his fly. I heard you talking, he said. Sons of bitches won't let old fellas sleep. When you bastards get dry behind the ears, you'll maybe learn to let old fellas sleep. His furious fingers managed to flip open the only two buttons on his fly that had been buttoned, and his hand forgot what it had been trying to do. His hand reached in and contentedly scratched under the testicles. Ma came in with wet hands, and her palms puckered and bloated from the hot water and soap. Thought you was sleepin'. Here, let me button you up. And though he struggled, she held him and buttoned his underwear and his shirt and his fly. You go around a sight, she said, and let him go. And he spluttered angrily. Fellas come too a nice, when somebody buttons them. I want to be let be to button my own pants. Ma said playfully. They don't let people run around with their clothes unbuttoned in California. They don't, hey? Well, I'll show 'em. They think they're going to show me how to act out there? Why, I'll go around and hanging out if I want. Ma said, seems like his language gets worse every year. Showing off, I guess. The old man thrust out his bristly chin and he regarded Ma with his shrewd, mean, merry eyes. Well, sir, he said, we'll be a-startin' 'fore long now, and by God, they's grapes out there, just a-hangin' over into the road. Know what I'm a-going to do? I'm going to pick me a washtub full of grapes, and I'm going to set in 'em, and scrooge around, and let the juice run down my pants. Tom laughed. By God, if he lives to be 200, you will never get Grandpa housebroke, he said. You're all set on going, ain't you, Grandpa? The old man pulled out a box and sat down heavily on it. Yes, sir, he said. And goddamn near time, too. My brother went out there 40 years ago. Never did hear nothing about him. Sneaky son of a bitch he was. Nobody loved him. Run off with a single-action Colt of mine. If I ever run across him or his kids, if he got any out in California, I'll ask him for that Colt. But if I know him and he got any kids, he cuckooed, excuse me, he cuckooed him and somebody else is a-raising him. I sure will be glad to get out there. Got a feeling it'll make a new fella out of me. Go right to work in the fruit. Ma nodded. He means it, too, she said. Worked right up to 3 months ago when he throwed his hip out the last time. Damn right, said Grandpa. Tom looked outward from his seat on the doorstep. Here comes that preacher, walking around from the back side of the barn. Ma said, curiousest grace I ever heard that he gave this morning. Wasn't hardly no grace at all, just talking, but the sound of it was like a grace. He's a funny fella, said Tom. Talks funny all the time. Seems like he's talking to himself, though. He ain't trying to put nothing over. Watch the look in his eye, said Ma. He looks baptized. Got that look they call looking through. Excuse me. He sure looks baptized, and a-walking with his head down, a-staring at nothing on the ground. There is a man that's baptized, and she was silent, for Casey and drawed near the door. You gonna get sunshook walking around like that, said Tom. Casey said, well, yeah, maybe. He appealed to them all suddenly, to Ma and Grandpa and Tom. I got to get going west. I got to go. I wonder if I can go along with you folks. And then he stood, embarrassed by his own speech. Ma looked to Tom to speak because he was a man, but Tom did not speak. She let him have the chance that was his right, and then she said, why, we'd be proud to have you. Of course, I can't say right now. Pa says all the men'll talk tonight and figure when we gonna start. I guess maybe we better not say till all the men come. John and Pa and Noah and Tom and Grandpa and Al and Connie. They gonna figure as soon as they get back. But if they's room, I'm pretty sure we'll be proud to have you. The preacher sighed. I'll go anyways, he said. Something's happening. I went up and I looked, and the houses is all empty, and the land is empty, and this whole country is empty. I can't stay here no more. I got to go where folks is going. I'll work in the fields, and maybe I'll be happy. And you ain't gonna preach? Tom asked. I ain't gonna preach. And you ain't gonna baptize? Ma asked. I ain't gonna baptize. I'm gonna work in the fields, in the green fields. And I'm gonna be near to folks. I ain't gonna try to teach 'em nothing. I'm gonna try to learn. Gonna learn why the folks walks in the grass. Gonna hear 'em talk. Gonna hear 'em sing. Gonna listen to kids eating mush. Gonna hear husband and wife a pounding the mattress in the night. Gonna eat with 'em and learn. His eyes were wet and shining. Gonna lay in the grass, open and honest with anybody that'll have me. Gonna cuss and swear and hear the poetry of folks talking. All that's holy. All that's what I didn't understand. All them things is the good things. The preacher sat humbly down on the chopping block beside the door. I wonder what they is for a fellow so lonely. Tom coughed delicately. For a fellow that don't preach no more, he began. Oh, I'm a talker, said Casey. No getting away from that. But I ain't preaching. Preaching is telling folks stuff. I'm asking 'em. That ain't preaching, is it? I don't know, said Tom. Preachin's a kind of tone of voice, and preachin's a way of looking at things. Preachin's being good to folks when they want to kill you for it. Last Christmas in McAllister, Salvation Army come and done us good. 3 solid hours of cornet music, and we set there. They was being nice to us, but if one of us tried to walk out, we'd a drawed solitary. That's preachin'. Doing good to a fellow that's down and can't smack you in the puss for it. No, you ain't no preacher, but don't you blow no cornets around here. Ma threw some sticks into the stove. I'll get you a bite now, but it ain't much. Grandpa brought his box outside and sat on it and leaned against the wall, and Tom and Casey leaned back against the house wall, and the shadow of the afternoon moved out from the house. In the late afternoon, the truck came back, bumping and rattling through the dust, and there was a layer of dust in the bed, and the hood was covered with dust, and the headlights were obscured with a red flower. The sun was setting when the truck came back, and the earth was bloody in its setting light. Al sat bent over the wheel, proud and serious and efficient, and Pa and Uncle John, as befitted the heads of the clan, had the honor seats beside the driver. Standing in the truck bed, holding onto the bars at the sides, rode the others. 12-year-old Ruthie and 10-year-old Winfield, grime-faced and wild, their eyes tired but excited, their fingers and the edges of their mouths black and sticky from licorice whips, whined out of their father in town. Ruthie, dressed in a real dress of pink muslin that came below her knees, was a little serious in her young ladiness, but Winfield was still a trifle of a snot-nose, a little of a brooder back of the barn, and an inveterate collector and smoker of snipes. And whereas Ruthie felt the might, the responsibility, and the dignity of her developing breasts, Winfield was kid wild and calfish. Beside them, clinging lightly to the bars, stood Rosa Sharon, and she balanced, swaying on the balls of her feet, and took up the road shock in her knees and hams. For Rosa Sharon was pregnant and careful. Her hair, braided and wrapped around her head, made an ash-blonde crown. Her round, soft face, which had been voluptuous and inviting a few months ago, had already put on the barrier of pregnancy, the self-sufficient smile, the knowing perfection look. And her plump body, full soft breasts and stomach, hard hips and buttocks that had swung so freely and provocatively as to invite slapping and stroking, her whole body had become demure and serious. Her whole thought and action were directed inward on the baby. She balanced on her toes now for the baby's sake, and the world was pregnant to her. She only thought in terms of reproduction and motherhood. Connie, her 19-year-old husband, who had married a plump, passionate hoyden, was still frightened and bewildered at the change in her, for there were no more catfights in bed, biting and scratching with muffled giggles and final tears. There was a balanced, careful, wise creature who smiled shyly, but very firmly at him. Connie was proud and fearful of Rosa Sharon. Whenever he could, he put a hand on her or stood close, so that his body touched her at hip and shoulder. And he felt that this kept a relation that might be departing. He was a sharp-faced, lean young man of a Texas strain, and his pale blue eyes were sometimes dangerous and sometimes kindly, and sometimes frightened. He was a good hard worker and would make a good husband. He drank enough, but not too much, fought when it was required of him, and never boasted. He sat quietly in a gathering and yet managed to be there and to be recognized. Had he not been 50 years old and so one of the natural rulers of the family, Uncle John would have preferred not to sit in the honor place beside the driver. He would have liked Rose of Sharon to sit there. This was impossible because she was young and a woman. But Uncle John sat uneasily. His lonely, haunted eyes were not at ease, and his thin, strong body was not relaxed. Nearly all the time, the barrier of loneliness cut off Uncle John from people and from appetites. He ate little, drank nothing, and was celibate. But underneath, his appetites swelled into pressures until they broke through. Then he would eat then he would eat of some craved food until he was sick, or he would drink gin or whiskey until he was a shaken paralytic with red wet eyes, or he would raven with lust for some whore in Salisaw. It was told of him that he once went clear to Shawnee and hired 3 whores in one bed, and snorted and rutted on their unresponsive bodies for an hour. But when one of his appetites was sated, he was sad and ashamed and lonely again. He hid from people, and by gifts tried to make up to all people for himself. Then he crept into houses and left gum under pillows for children. Then he cut wood and took no pay. Then he gave away any possessions he might have, a saddle, a horse, a new pair of shoes. One could not talk to him then, for he ran away, or if confronted, hid within himself and peeked out of frightened eyes. The death of his wife, followed by months of being alone, had marked him with guilt and shame and had left an unbreaking loneliness on him. But there were things he could not escape. Being one of the heads of the family, he had to govern, and now he had to sit on the honor seat beside the driver. 3 men on the seat were glum as they drove toward home over the dusty road. Al, bending over the wheel, kept shifting eyes from the road to the instrument panel, watching the ammeter needle, which jerked suspiciously, watching the oil gauge and the heat indicator, and his mind was cataloging weak points and suspicious things about the car. He listened to the whine, which might be the rear end, dry, and he listened to the tappets lifting and falling. He kept his hand on the gear lever, feeling the turning gears through it, and he had let the clutch out against the brake to test for slipping clutch plates. He might be a musking goat sometimes, but this was his responsibility, this truck, its running and its maintenance. If something went wrong, it would be his fault. And while no one would say it, everyone, and Al most of all, would know it was his fault. And so he felt it, watched it, and listened to it. And his face was serious and responsible, and everyone respected him and his responsibility. Even Pa, who was the leader, would hold a wrench and take orders from Al. They were all tired on the truck. Ruthie and Winfield were tired from seeing too much movement, too many faces, from fighting to get licorice whips, tired from the excitement of having Uncle John secretly slip gum into their pockets. And the men in the seat were tired and angry and sad, for they had got $18 for every movable thing from the farm. The horses, the wagon, the implements, and all the furniture from the house. $18. They had assailed the buyer, argued, but they were routed when his interest seemed to flag, and he had told them he didn't want the stuff at any price. Then they were beaten, believed him, and took $2 less than he had first offered. And now they were weary and frightened because they had gone against a system they did not understand, and it had beaten them. They knew the team and the wagon were worth much more. They knew the buyer man would get much more, but they didn't know how to do it. Merchandising was a secret to them. Al, his eyes darting from road to panel board, said, "That fella, he ain't a local fella. Didn't talk like a local fella. Clothes was different, too." And Paul explained, "When I was in the hardware store, I talked to some men I know. They say there's fellas coming in just to buy up the stuff us fellas got to sell when we get out. They say these new fellas is cleaning up, but there ain't nothing we can do about it. Maybe Tommy should have went. Maybe he could have did better." John said, "But the fella wasn't going to take it all. We couldn't haul it back." "These men I know told about that," said Pa. "Said the buyer fella's always done that. Scared folks that way. We just don't know how to go about stuff like that. Ma's going to be disappointed. She'll be mad and disappointed." Al said, "When do you think we're going to go, Pa?" "I don't know. We'll talk her over tonight and decide. I'm sure glad Tom's back. That makes me feel good. Tom's a good boy." Al said, "Pa, some fellas was asking about Tom, and they says he's parole." and they say that means he can't go outside the state, or if he goes and they catch him, they send him back for 3 years. Pa looked startled. They said that? Seemed like fellas that knowed, not just blowing off? I don't know, said Al. They was just a talking there, and I didn't let on he's my brother. I just stood and took it in. Pa said, Jesus Christ, I hope that ain't true. We need Tom. I'll ask him about that. We got trouble enough without they chased the hell out of us. I hope it ain't true. We got to talk that out in the open. Uncle John said, Tom, he'll know. They fell silent while the truck battered along. The engine was noisy, full of little clashings, and the brake rods banged. There was a wooden creaking from the wheels, and a thin jet of steam escaped through a hole in the top of the radiator cap. The truck pulled a high whirling column of red dust behind it. They rumbled up the last little rise while the sun was still half-face above the horizon, and they bore down on the house as it disappeared. The brakes squealed when they stopped, and the sound printed in Al's head, no lining left. Ruthie and Winfield climbed, yelling over the side walls, and dropped to the ground. They shouted, Where is he? Where's Tom? And then they saw him standing beside the door, and they stopped, embarrassed, and walked slowly toward him and looked shyly at him. And when he said, Hello, how you kids doing? They replied softly, Hello, all right. And they stood apart and watched him secretly, the great brother who had killed a man and been in prison. They remembered how they had played prison in the chicken coop and fought for the right to be prisoner. Connie Rivers lifted the high tailgate out of the truck and got down and helped Rosa Sharon to the ground. And she accepted it nobly, smiling her wise, self-satisfied smile, mouth tipped at the corners a little fatuously. Tom said, Why, it Rosa Sharon. I didn't know you was coming with them. We was walking, she said. The truck came by and picked us up. And then she said, This is Connie, my husband. And she was grand saying it. The two shook hands, sizing each other up, looking deeply into each other, and in a moment each was satisfied, and Tom said, Well, I see you've been busy. She looked down. You do not see, not yet. Pa told me. When's it going to be? Oh, not for a long time, not till next winter. Tom laughed. Gonna get him boring orange ranch, huh? In one of them white houses with orange trees all around? Rosa Sharon felt her stomach with both her hands. You do not see, she said, and she smiled her complacent smile and went into the house. The evening was hot, and the thrust of light still flowed from the western horizon, and without any signal the family gathered by the truck, and the Congress, the family government, went into session. The film of evening light made the red earth lucent, so that its dimensions were deepened, so that a stone, a post, a building had greater depth and more solidity than in the daytime light. And these objects were curiously more individual. A post was more essentially a post, set off from the earth it stood in, and the field of corn it stood out against. All plants were individuals, not the massive crop, and the ragged willow tree was itself, standing free of all other willow trees. Excuse me.